They did not want a scandal. They wanted silence. But from the moment her head fell to the wooden scaffold with a sickening thud, the legend of Mary, Queen of Scots, refused to rot. This was not just a queen. This was a woman crowned in infancy, imprisoned in adulthood, and decapitated before she could defend herself in any way that mattered. They thought an axe would erase her. They thought a quiet burial in a cathedral far from the capital would stop the whispers. But they were wrong, because when they opened her grave, nearly 25 years later, what they found was something no king or court ever wanted seen again. Her death was not a clean execution. It was a spectacle soaked in hesitation and horror. Elizabeth, Queen of England, waited months before signing the death warrant. It sat on her desk like a ghost she couldn't touch. A decision too big, even for a monarch who had survived plots, poison, and papal excommunication. But the moment came in early February of the year, 1587. Mary was told she would die the next morning. She did not cry. She did not beg. She chose her own dress, a black satin gown, a crimson underdress, and a white veil. A crucifix was placed in her hands. She knew what image she wanted, burned into the minds of her killers, not a traitor, but a Catholic martyr. She walked into the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle, as if walking into a chapel, her head high, her hands steady, her voice composed. The crowd of nobles and officials was silent. The scaffold was draped in black. The cushion she was to kneel upon had been carefully placed. The executioners stood masked in black to protect their names. She gave her final words. She forgave her enemies. She commended her soul to God. And then she knelt. But the axe missed its mark. The first blow landed on the back of her skull. Gasps filled the room. The second swing cut deeper, but still did not finish the task. Only on the third did her head come free. The executioner lifted it for the crowd and cried, "God save the Queen." But the horror was not yet done. Her hair came off in his hand. It was a wig. Her head fell from his grasp and bounced across the scaffold like a dropped object. The audience recoiled. Some turned away. Even the toughest of them looked as if they'd seen a vision from hell. And then there was the dog. Her small white terrier had followed her in secret, hiding beneath her skirts the entire time, trembling through every swing of the axe. After her death, the dog refused to leave her body. When they tried to pull it away, it growled and whimpered, its fur sticky with her blood. In that moment, even the men tasked with disposing of her body paused. For all their hatred of the Catholic Queen of Scots, what they had witnessed felt more like a crucifixion than a political act. And that terrified them. Her body was stripped. Her clothes were burned. Protestant officials feared that Catholics would take scraps as relics, turning the dead queen into a saint. They embalmed her hastily, wrapped her in cerecloth, and placed her into a lead-lined coffin. But no one wanted to decide where she should be buried. She was a queen. Yes, but also a convicted traitor. In the Tudor world, that meant your remains belonged to the state. And the punishment did not end at death. Some were buried in unmarked pits. Others had their heads stuck on pikes above London Bridge. For Mary, months passed with no burial. Her body remained in a side room of the castle, wrapped like a secret, left to decay in silence. Finally, in late July of that same year, nearly half a year after her execution, her coffin was moved. The destination, Peterborough Cathedral, far from the capital, far from Westminster, far from any place where mourners might come in numbers. The man who dug her grave was over 90 years old, known only as Old Scarlet. He had dug many graves, but none like this. No royal vault was prepared, just a pit near the high altar, opposite the grave of Katherine of Aragon. And even then, her funeral was done without grandeur. No royal music, no eulogy from the crown, The officers present snapped their ceremonial staffs and threw them into the grave, a sign that their duty to the dead was done, and then she was forgotten. Or so they thought, because in the year 1612, her son, James, now King of England, ordered her dug up. He could not bear to leave his mother in such a neglected place. He had a new tomb built in Westminster Abbey, a grand white monument with an effigy of her lying in stone, eyes closed, crown atop her head. But to place her there, they needed her body. The first grave was broken into, the floor was torn open, the coffin was hauled out, heavy with lead and time and secrets. It was placed on a carriage and dragged to London. What they saw when they opened it remains unclear. Some say her body had decayed badly. Despite the embalming, others say the coffin had collapsed in on itself, and still others suggest that relics were taken secretly, quietly, by those who believed her to be a saint. What is certain is that when her body was placed in the new vault, it was not alone. Over time, others were buried beside her. The tomb that was meant to be her eternal honor became a shared crypt, crowded and unstable. Today, her first grave still exists. A few stones, a plaque, a silence. But it is a silence that speaks. Because this is not just the story of a queen who died. It is the story of a woman killed by fear, buried by politics, and exhumed by guilt. They tried to silence her with an axe, but the blade missed, and her story has never stopped bleeding. It did not begin with an axe, nor with a prison, nor even with a queen, though it would end with all three. It began, as so many endings do, with a letter, a piece of parchment, hidden, passed hand to hand, through cloisters and corridors, inked with plans, and signed by those who believed that God had turned his face away from England, and that blood was the only ink that could rewrite the future. A letter that named Mary, Queen of Scots, not as a prisoner, but as a queen in waiting, a sovereign to be restored, a rightful monarch to be placed on a throne that, to some, had never belonged to Elizabeth Tudor at all. And it was this letter, when finally placed before Elizabeth's eyes by the cold, calculating hands of her spy chief, Sir Francis Walsingham, that became the first whisper of the rope tightening around Mary's throat. They would later call it the Babington Plot, after the young man who dreamed it into being Anthony Babington, a nobleman with more passion than sense, who believed in the divine right of monarchy, in papal supremacy, and in the sacred suffering of a queen unjustly caged. He was not alone. Across England, Catholics whispered in secret circles, praying for deliverance, longing for the return of the old faith, fearing the future their children were being raised into, and in the eyes of those who still crossed themselves in dark corners. Mary was not merely a symbol, she was a solution. Her blood was royal, her faith was pure, her captivity was a crime that cried out for correction. To them, she was the rightful queen, and if Elizabeth had to die to make that right, so be it. But England under Elizabeth had teeth sharper than any crown, and its greatest blade did not swing from an executioner's axe. It moved through the shadows in the form of Walsingham's intelligence network, a web of watchers and whisperers, code breakers and trap setters, a court of invisible hands, always listening, always recording, always moving 3 steps ahead. Walsingham knew the pressure was building. He had watched Mary's supporters grow bolder, and so he set the bait. He allowed Babington's messages to pass, each one intercepted, copied, decrypted, and resealed, sent on its way like a bird with clipped wings, never knowing it would not return. Mary, locked inside the cold walls of Chartley Hall, under the ever-watchful eye of her keeper, Sir Amias Paulet, had little else to cling to. Letters were her only escape, her only voice in a world that had silenced her. So when Babington's proposals reached her smuggled in beer barrels, hidden beneath wax seals, written in cipher, she responded. She answered not with a command, but with cautious approval. She asked for details. She confirmed names. She hinted at trust. She did not write "kill the Queen." But the ink ran close enough. That was all Walsingham needed. He had her handwriting. He had her seal. He had the cipher, broken and betrayed. And he had Parliament, restless and hungry, terrified of rebellion, of Spanish invasion, of Catholic uprisings fueled by the blood of martyrs. They pushed Elizabeth. They demanded justice. They demanded an end. And Elizabeth, torn between cousin and crown, between fear and duty, resisted for weeks. She trembled at the thought, not out of mercy but out of dread. To kill a queen, even a rival one, was to break the sacred thread of divine monarchy. If Mary could be executed, so too could any sovereign, including Elizabeth herself. Still, the pressure mounted. Babington was arrested, tortured, and hanged alongside his conspirators. And Elizabeth, perhaps convinced, perhaps cornered, finally signed the warrant. But even then, she delayed. She hoped, maybe, that someone else would hesitate, that mercy would arrive like fog on the morning of execution. But mercy, in Tudor England, came late or not at all, the morning Mary received the news. She did not flinch. She was 44 years old, her body weakened by years of captivity, her hair greyed beneath the veil, her hands calloused by prayer. She was told that she would die at dawn, and with the calm of a woman who had rehearsed this moment for decades, she began to prepare. She wrote letters. One, to Henry III of France, is still remembered as one of the most haunting farewells in royal history. In it, she did not beg for life. She did not protest. She declared herself a martyr, a Catholic, a queen wronged by false charges, a woman whose blood would, she believed, nourish the roots of true faith across Europe. That night, she prayed. Her ladies wept. They knew what would come. They dressed her not in royal robes, but in symbols: crimson for Christ's blood, black for mourning, white for purity. And as dawn broke, they walked with her, step by step, down the long stone corridors of Fotheringhay Castle. The men who waited for her did not see a traitor. They saw something else, something terrifying and holy and impossible to look at for long. Because Mary was not just walking to her death. She was walking into history. And history, once it swallows a woman whole, rarely lets her go gently. The scaffold was cold. The executioners masked. The officials silent. Her final words were a prayer in Latin: "Into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." She knelt. The axe fell, and it was not quick. The blade struck the back of her skull. Not once, not twice, but thrice. On the third blow, her head came free, but not before the air was filled with the sound of bone splitting and a low groan that witnesses said echoed off the vaulted ceilings like a curse. The executioner raised her head. Her hair came off in his hands. A wig. Her real head dropped, bounced, rolled. The silence that followed was not reverent. It was stunned, shattered. Her dog crept out from beneath her skirts. Blood soaked its fur. It refused to leave. They burned her clothes. They stripped her body. They searched for relics, for proof of Catholic devotion. And then they sealed her in a coffin of lead and left her in the cold, unopened room of the same castle where her life had ended. Days passed. Then weeks, then months. She was not buried until more than 5 months later. But by then, it did not matter. The plot had done its work. The letter had turned to rope. The ink had become a wound, and though she was finally buried beneath the stones of Peterborough Cathedral, what lay above her was not peace but silence. A silence that would last nearly 25 years, until the day her son ordered that the ground be broken, the coffin exhumed, and the queen who had died in chains be placed, at last, in a tomb of marble and honour. But the ground remembers, the ink remembers, and the plot that wrote her death warrant is still there somewhere beneath the blood, beneath the altar, beneath the crown, waiting. There are moments in history that refuse to fade. No matter how many centuries fall between them and the present, they cling to the fabric of memory like dried blood on linen, refusing to wash away. Mary's execution was one such moment, not because of the politics that led to it, nor even the horror of the axe that failed to do its work swiftly, but because of what came after, because of what followed her to the scaffold, and what stayed behind when her breath had gone. Not a sword, not a royal seal, not even the crown she had once worn. What remained was softer, quieter, infinitely more human. A dog, a vial, and a crimson memory that stained more than just the wood beneath her. The sky was pale that morning, the sun not yet fully risen when the heavy doors of Fotheringhay opened, and the Queen of Scots walked her final steps. The great hall had been transformed into a room of ritual and death, its stone floor darkened with cloth, its scaffold raised like a wooden altar waiting for sacrifice. Silence hung over the witnesses as thickly as the velvet drapes that swallowed the light. And in that silence, Mary entered not like a prisoner, but like a bride, to her final vow. She wore black satin, carefully chosen, every seam pulled tight against her frame as if to hold her together when everything else had been taken. Beneath it, a crimson underskirt and matching sleeves whispered of the blood she was ready to spill. And perhaps, hoped would mean something once it was gone. A crucifix hung from her neck, a rosary swung gently at her waist. But the most haunting part of her appearance was the veil white, sheer, light as breath, resting over her head and shoulders, turning her into a ghost before she had even died. And she was not alone. Hidden beneath the folds of her gown, nestled in the warm space between her feet and the cold stone floor, there was a small creature no one had expected. It had followed her from her chambers without a sound. It had curled itself under her skirt, perhaps sensing the dread that clung to the fabric like perfume. It was her companion, her secret, her shadow, Asciterier, small, white, loyal, and it would not leave her, not even in death. The climb to the scaffold was slow. Her steps were deliberate. Her ladies held back tears as they watched her ascend, knowing they could not follow. The masked executioners flanked the block. Her jailers stood rigid at the edge of the platform, and the witnesses, lords, priests, secretaries gathered in a tight ring, watching a scene they would be forced to recount for the rest of their lives. Whether in official dispatches or in nightmares, they would never speak aloud. Mary knelt on the cushion. She placed the crucifix before her. She whispered final prayers in Latin. Not loud, not for performance, but as if the words were stitched into her bones. And then she reached up and carefully removed the white veil from her hair, revealing locks that had turned silver with time. Threaded now with the weight of betrayal and patience and prayer, she folded the veil and handed it to one of her ladies. A gesture so gentle, so careful, that it felt as if she was still a queen preparing for a court appearance, and not a woman about to be struck from life. She laid her head upon the block. She stretched her arms out in the shape of a cross, and then she waited. The axe fell, but the first strike was wrong. It missed her neck and struck the back of her skull, making a sound not unlike wood splintering under pressure. A low gasp rippled through the hall. The second blow was closer, cutting deep but still incomplete. The third finally severed what the others could not. Her head was raised for the crowd, her eyes closed, her face frozen mid-prayer. But even then, the moment refused to behave. Her hair detached. The head fell. It hit the scaffold with a dull knock and rolled slightly before coming to rest against the block where her blood now pooled. And from beneath the folds of her gown, the dog emerged. Small, trembling, its white fur already smeared with red. It did not bark. It did not run. It simply crept toward her body, curled against it, and refused to be moved. The executioners tried to shoo it away. The guards reached for it, but the creature bared its teeth, growled low, and pressed itself against the lifeless form of the only human it had ever trusted. They had stripped Mary of everything: her title, her crown, her dignity, but not of this. Not of the silent love of an animal who could not be commanded by politics or broken by doctrine. The dog knew only loyalty, and that loyalty, unlike the royal houses of Europe, would not betray her. Later, they would remove it by force. They would drag it away. Fur sticky with blood, paws stained by death, eyes wide and confused. No record survives of what happened to it after, but its appearance that day would be noted in every account, spoken in every tongue, remembered in every chamber where power thought itself immune to grief. Her body, once the center of scandal and conspiracy, was reduced to ritual. It was stripped naked. Her clothes were burned. The Protestant authorities feared relics, that pieces of her dress or rosary might be stolen, revered, worshipped as holy artifacts of a martyred queen. Her skin, which had once been described as ivory and flawless, was now cold and pale. They embalmed her, wrapping her tightly in cerecloth, sealing her inside a coffin of lead, as if to keep her from seeping into the world again. But nothing they did could erase the image. The veil placed so carefully in a hand now severed, the pool of blood slowly darkening the cloth beneath her, the dog pressing itself against her corpse in a silence more powerful than any prayer. And for days afterward, the scent of blood lingered in the air of that hall. The wood was scrubbed, the cloth removed, the platform dismantled, but the stain remained. No matter what they did, they could not wash it clean. It was not just a political death. It was a rupture, and when they finally laid her to rest months later, burying her in a cathedral far from London, far from majesty, far from justice, they did so not with reverence, but with fear. Fear that she would be remembered, that she would become more than a corpse, that the blood she shed would ferment into something powerful and inconvenient. And so they buried her quietly, away from the capital, away from shrines, away from the places where queens were meant to lie. But the blood was never fully washed, and the veil, folded and passed down, became a relic anyway. And the dog, white, loyal, nameless, became a symbol far more lasting than a crown. Because history does not always remember what kings want it to. Sometimes it remembers the dog, the veil, the blood, and sometimes it remembers that they were never truly gone. The axe had fallen, the body had stilled, the blood had stopped moving. But the story did not end when her breath did. In truth, it entered a darker chapter, one not written in letters or proclamations, not carved in marble or whispered in council chambers, but sealed inside four walls, behind a door that stayed closed for far too long. Mary, Queen of Scots, did not go to her grave, as queens are meant to. There was no grand procession, no royal bell tolling across the sky, no solemn march through the heart of her adopted kingdom. Instead, she remained exactly where she fell, or nearly so, moved only a few corridors down from the scaffold, to a side room within the cold stone of Fotheringhay Castle. A room with no name, nor windows, nor flowers, and for many months, no exit. The decision not to bury her immediately was not one born of reverence. It was hesitation. It was politics. It was fear. Because for all the precision with which the execution had been arranged, no one had planned for the body. The death warrant had been signed in haste and secrecy. The execution had been carried out swiftly, almost brutally. But the burial, that was a question too dangerous to answer quickly. Where do you place the body of a queen executed by another queen? Where do you send the flesh and bone of a woman who had once ruled, who had once claimed the English throne by divine right, and who had died proclaiming her innocence and her faith? They could not place her in Westminster, where the tombs of English royalty lay heavy with legitimacy. They could not ship her back to Scotland, a land still raw with divided loyalties. They could not bury her with the common dead. For her blood, however condemned, was still blue. And so they did. The only thing they could do, they stalled. They wrapped her body in waxed linen. They sealed her in lead. And they left her in a room that no one wanted to name. The room was small, rectangular, tucked away behind the great hall. Its windows, if it had any, were too high for light to reach. The walls were bare stone, stained with damp, lined with the smell of cold earth and old lime. There were no candles left burning. No one was allowed to pray there. Only a few guards were posted at the door, not out of respect, but out of concern that someone might try to enter and take something: a rosary bead, a lock of hair, a drop of blood still not dried on the shroud. In that room, the body of Mary Stuart remained untouched by earth, untouched by fire, untouched by ceremony. It lay there like a secret England could not decide what to do with. For days, then weeks, then months, winter passed. Spring came, and still, she waited, wrapped in cerecloth. Her limes stiffened. Her face, once cold, luminous in youth, shrank beneath the veil of death. Her skin, embalmed too quickly, too clumsily, began to collapse inward. The lead coffin, designed to preserve, instead became a prison. Her dog, long removed and likely dead or discarded, could not return. Her ladies were sent away. Some said the room smelled of myrrh and old roses. Others said it stank of rot and regret. Most refused to speak of it at all. Meanwhile, England moved on. Elizabeth continued to rule. The council debated matters of state. Letters were sent. Wars were planned. But within the belly of Fotheringhay, that single room remained frozen in time. A bruise. The kingdom refused to acknowledge. Even the official documents skirted the truth. Referring to the Queen's remains, as if naming her too clearly might conjure her back, it was not until late July, more than 5 months after the axe had fallen, that the coffin was finally moved. And by then, the weight of inaction had settled over every detail of what followed. Her funeral would be held in Peterborough Cathedral. Not in grandeur, but in necessity. The choice was political. Distant, quiet. She would be buried not in a vault, but in a grave dug by an old man with shaking hands, opposite the first wife of the king, who had once turned England upside down for love. But that was still weeks away. Before that could happen, the coffin had to be prepared. Men entered the room in silence. They did not speak. They did not look too long. They lifted the lead coffin carefully, surprised by how cold it remained, how heavy. One guard whispered that the air felt thicker the moment the lid lifted from the stone. Another said he felt watched. One man vomited in the corridor and was replaced without comment. The journey to Peterborough was quiet. No fanfare, no mourning crowds, just a slow, lumbering procession with a queen inside a box no one dared open. And behind them, in that castle with its grey walls and bloodied history, the room was cleaned. The cloth was burned. The floor was scrubbed with lime and vinegar. The scent of decay was masked with rosemary, but none of it worked. The stain was still there, and some say it always would be, because that room, more than the scaffold or the tomb or the cathedral, was where Mary truly became a ghost. It was not death that turned her into legend. It was the weight. The cruel, quiet weight, where her body refused to decompose in peace, and the world refused to remember her out loud. There was no greater crime than forgetting her there, and no greater punishment than the knowledge that even in silence, she would not stay buried. In that room, the Queen of Scots did not rest. She waited. They came to him just before dawn, when the cathedral still slept beneath its stone ribs, and the morning mist had not yet lifted from the close. He was already awake. Of course, he had not truly slept in years, not since his hands had begun to curl with time, not since his knees ached when the weather changed, not since the whispers had started about the room, no one used and the body no one had buried. They came to him because he was the last to remember the old rites, the last with hands that had dug for kings and commoners alike. And on that pale morning, as light spilled across the empty flagstones, they came with a quiet command: dig a grave. For a queen, he was called Old Scarlet. That's what they said, though. None remembered if it was his name, or just a title earned by outliving those who once called him anything else. His back was bent like a question mark. His hair was thin, and the color of smoke, but his eyes, they said, were still sharp as splinters, and his hearing better than most boys at market. He did not speak often, but when he did, the words came like stones falling in water, slow, heavy, unchanging. And that morning, when they handed him the rolled parchment with its neat ink and broken seal, he only read it once, before folding it in half and tucking it into his belt. Then he took up his spade, his lantern, and a piece of bread, and walked alone toward the choir. The cathedral was hollow with silence. He had walked its length thousands of times, each step echoing through years of prayer and burial. But today it felt different. Today, even the light seemed to hesitate before touching the stones. He passed the high altar, past the tomb of Katherine of Aragon, she who had once worn the same crown the dead queen now brought in her coffin, and he stopped where the parchment told him to stop beneath the southern arch. In a narrow space between stone ribs and ancient dust, where no one came to weep and no one came to remember. He set the lantern down. He rubbed his palms together. Then he drove the blade of the spade into the floor. The earth was dry, packed tight with years of silence. Each strike shook through his shoulders and into his spine. He did not hurry. He did not speak. He just dug. 1 foot of depth, then 2, then more. Around him, the cathedral breathed its cold breath, and above him, the ribs of the vault watched like silent gods. They brought the coffin at midday. It arrived not with trumpets or morning banners, but with the shuffling steps of a few men who did not look each other in the eyes. The coffin was heavy, lined with lead, sealed shut. It bore no crest, no crown, no marks of state. The queen inside it had been dead for over 5 months. And now, finally, she was being lowered into the ground, not as a monarch, but as a question that no one had yet dared to answer. Scarlet stood at the edge of the grave and watched. No choidsang, no priest intoned. Only the Dean of Peterborough read a short passage from the Book of Common Prayer, voice low and clipped, as if afraid to say her name aloud. When the final amen drifted up to the beams above, the officers present raised their black staffs above their heads and broke them in half. One by one, they threw the pieces into the grave atop her coffin. It was a gesture meant to signal the end of duty, that no man there would serve her again. Scarlet waited until they left. He sat beside the fresh mound and pulled the bread from his coat. He chewed slowly, staring at the place where the earth now held what an axe had undone. He had buried many in his time. Thieves, bishops, children lost before their first winter, but never a queen. Never a woman whose death had made the entire kingdom hold its breath. Later, they would ask him what he saw that day. He would not say, but some claimed that he muttered as he walked home. Something about a dog that waited in the afterlife. About hair that fell in his dreams. About a voice singing in Latin though no one was there. No one could prove it. But those who passed the cathedral in the weeks that followed said the stones near her grave stayed damp, even on dry mornings, that a chill lingered in that corner long after the fires were lit for Christmas, that something there refused to rest. Old Scarlet would he not long after, and they would bury him near the woman he had helped return to the earth. Perhaps, in his silence, he understood what the others could not, how death is not the end, when the grave is carved by shame, how the ground remembers what politics tries to bury, how the spade knows secrets that history forgets. In the end, the grave was quiet, but the man who dug it knew what silence really meant, and he carried it with him, until the earth took him. 2. He was not there when she died. He was not there when the axe missed its mark the first time, nor when the crowd gasped, nor when the veil was folded and passed away like a flag of surrender. He was not there when the dog crept out from under her skirts, or when the men carried her body to the cold side room like a burden they didn't know how to set down, and when she was buried quietly, in a cathedral that did not want her. He was still not there, but James, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, would return, not in person, not with tears, but with a signature, a seal, a decree. He did not come to mourn. He came to move her. James had been crowned as King of Scotland, while still a baby. A crown placed on a head, too soft to bear it. His mother had kissed him goodbye as a prisoner, her face still young, her hopes still high, and she had never held him again. From that moment on, he had been raised by strangers, shaped by ministers, advised by those who warned him not to speak her name, not to honour her memory, not to become her mirror. He was taught that loyalty to England meant silence, that survival meant forgetting, and so for years, he did just that. He ruled, he obeyed, he survived, and then Elizabeth died. It was the year 1603. The long shadow of the Tudor reign fell for the last time, and the crown of England, heavy and blood-soaked, was offered to the son of the woman they had once silenced. James became king, not only of Scotland, but of England too, 2 crowns now pressed into one brow, 2 legacies, braided with thorns. And as he walked the halls of Westminster, as he sat upon the throne once denied to his mother, the ghosts began to stir. She had died for this. She had been executed in Elizabeth's name, her blood shed in the name of Protestant safety, of dynastic certainty. And now, it was her son who ruled over both realms, her son who inherited the crown, her son who carried the silence she left behind. And perhaps, in the quiet of those early days as king, James felt that silence press against him like the weight of the sceptre itself, because within months, he gave an order no one expected. He commanded that his mother be moved, exhumed, removed from the grave that had tried to forget her, and placed instead beneath the marble floors of Westminster Abbey. He ordered a tomb befitting a queen, a monument to memory, a rewriting of the end she had been given. But to do that, they would have to disturb the dead. It had been nearly 25 years. The coffin had not been touched since that day in Peterborough, when old Scarlet had shovelled the last mound of earth atop it and wiped his brow without a word. It had rested beneath the cathedral floor, among the quiet stones, opposite the first wife of Henry VIII, surrounded by nothing but time. And now, men came with tools, with ropes, with orders from the king himself. The floor was opened. The dust rose like breath long held in, and slowly, reverently, with more curiosity than sorrow, they lifted her from the earth. The coffin was sealed in lead, but lead is not impervious to time. When they pried it from the grave and set it atop the wooden carriage that would take her to London, they noted its weight, its dampness, the way it seemed to groan as it shifted, as if the air inside had not been meant to escape. Some said the odour clung to the robes of those who handled it for days. Others whispered that the shape of her was still visible inside, preserved, distorted, held together by wax and pressure and will. The journey south was not ceremonial. There was no grand parade, not royal crowds, no grieving masses, only a carriage, a box, a body. The countryside passed by like a dream half forgotten, and at the end of it stood the Abbey Westminster, ancient and shadowed, where kings and queens lay side by side beneath stones too worn to read. A new vault had been prepared. James had spared, no expense. Sculptors were commissioned. Marble was carved. A recumbent effigy of Mary was shaped in alabaster eyes closed. Hands folded. Features calm, as if her life had not ended in blood and shock and cries, as if she had died peacefully, beneath warm sheets and whispered prayers, as if history could be corrected with stone. The coffin was placed beneath the floor. The tomb was sealed, and above it, the statue of the woman who had once been called traitor now lay like a saint in sleep. But there was no ceremony that could undo what had been done. No tomb, however grand, that could erase the stain of her final hours. Winter passed. Spring came. And still, she waited, wrapped in cerecloth. Ere limes stiffened. Her face, once called luminous in youth, shrank beneath the veil of death. Her skin, embalmed too quickly, too clumsily, began to collapse inward. The lead coffin, designed to preserve, instead became a prison. Her dock, long removed and likely dead or discarded, could not return. Her ladies were sent away, and perhaps, in that gaze, he had seen what they had tried to bury, that a queen is not made by the way she dies, but by the way she is remembered. And James, though too late to save her, would not let her stay forgotten. Not entirely. Not beneath that cold floor in Peterborough. Not in the silence of a cathedral that had never mourned her. He could not give her life again, but he could move her bones. And sometimes, in history, that is the closest thing to love. The road was long and quiet. No drums, no banners, no chwide, only the sound of iron-rimmed wheels grinding over dirt and gravel. Only the creak of wood under the weight of a coffin, too long sealed, too long buried, too long forgotten. And inside, the body of Mary, Queen of Scots, draped in darkness, wrapped in waxed linen, held together by silence, and lead was being carried across the land she had once claimed by right of blood, but never ruled in life. England, at last, was hers, but she would see none of it. This was not the kind of procession the people had grown to expect for royalty. There was no velvet canopy, no nobles in mourning black, no streets lined with weeping crowds, no waft of incense, no echo of church bells from steeples, only a handful of attendants, hand-picked by a court that wished to honour her without drawing too much attention. Travelling southward from Peterborough to London with a casket that had spent more time beneath the earth than most men spent above it. She had waited nearly 25 years for this journey. And now, she moved not as a queen, but as a relic, a body more useful in death than in life. It is said the carriage creaked with every turn, the wooden wheels screaming softly with the weight of guilt they carried. Some horses refused to move. Others stumbled. At one village, the driver claimed the wheels locked without reason, as though something beneath the coffin resisted the journey. The leaden box inside, swollen with the moisture of years and the slow collapse of what once had been royal flesh, gave off no scent, but still, the men riding behind it swore they could smell the faintest trace of something sweet and rotting, like pressed roses left too long in the sun. No crowds gathered to watch her pass. Most did not even know who she was. Those who did remembered a Catholic queen, a foreign queen, A woman who had conspired, or so they'd been told. Some watched the slow carriage pass with suspicion, others with confusion, a few with pity. None dared approach. The land through which she passed had changed. New churches stood where abbeys had once risen. The people spoke with accents her Scottish ears would not have recognized. The countryside had been flattened by the weight of wars, of plagues, two of politics that moved like storms across the fields. Yet still, the road stretched on, and the Queen rolled forward in her coffin. There were moments rare and unrecorded, when it is said the horses stopped for no reason, standing frozen in the morning fog, that the crows flew overhead in silence, that the driver would look behind him and swear he saw her shadow flicker in the carriage windows, though no light could reach inside. One legend says that a child, no older than 10, stood by the roadside and wept as she passed, though no one had told him why. When the procession reached London, there was no fanfare, no cannon fire, no open gates, just a city that moved as if unaware, turning its face away from the past that had now returned in a box. Westminster Abbey had been prepared. Beneath its vast stone ribs, a new vault had been carved into the earth, lined with marble, marked for a queen who had never worn England's crown but whose blood now ruled the kingdom. The coffin was lowered with care. Men strained to guide the weight. The lead groaned. The silence pressed against the walls. Above, the tomb waited. A statue of white alabaster lay ready, her likeness carved in soft repose. Hands folded in prayer. Eyes forever closed. Lips sealed in the peace she was never granted in life. She looked younger than she had been at death. Softer, more obedient, as if the sculptor had chiseled not the woman, but the memory others wished to keep of her. There was no trace of the woman who had once raised an army, no hint of the queen who had fought her cousin in letters and politics and plots, no echo of the prisoner who had walked to the scaffold with crimson skirts and a white veil. This statue did not bleed. It did not speak. It did not tremble. And perhaps that was the point. To turn the story into stone, to turn the queen into something that could not speak again. And yet, beneath it all, under marble and prayers and royal seals, lay the same body, the same broken neck, the same forgotten hair, the same woman who had once believed that death would cleanse her name. But death does not cleanse her. It corrodes, and sometimes it remembers. They closed the tomb. The abbey fell silent. The queen had arrived. But what kind of arrival was this? A journey too late. A crown never worn. A son who had buried her not with tears, but with instruction. The parade of the dead queen was over. But the road still remembered the weight of her. The wheels that cut into the dirt. The silence that followed her through every village, every field, and somewhere, beyond the reach of England's stones and stories, there still moved the faintest echo of hooves in mist, of wheels over gravel, of a queen passing through the land that never welcomed her until it was too late. They sealed the vault with care. They placed the stone like a promise. They stood above the grave of Mary, Queen of Scots, and declared her finally at peace. But peace is not found in marble, nor in lead, nor even in Westminster Abbey. And the tomb they gave her grand, white, shining in candlelight, could not protect her. Not from memory, not from time, not even from the living. For a while, it was enough. The statue lay above her like a sleeping twin, carved with grace, her hands folded neatly over her chest, her eyelids closed in the suggestion of forgiveness. Visitors came. They whispered. They stepped softly. Some crossed themselves. Others did not dare. To them, she was history now tamed, preserved, placed beneath stone like an artifact. The scandal of her death was wrapped in years. The axe that struck her neck 3 times was no longer spoken of. The dog, the veil, the The smell of her room, all of it buried, or so they thought, because Westminster Abbey, for all its majesty, is not a place of stillness. It is a hive. It is a living body. And it shifts. It breathes. Dynasties rise and fall, that the weight of others had pressed down until the sides gave way, that the inscriptions had faded, that the seals had peeled, that her bones, what remained of them, lay broken in the folds of cloth that had once wrapped them in honour, and yet the statue above never changed. The alabaster smile, the gentle hands, the illusion of peace. It remained untouched by what festered below. That, perhaps, is the tragedy of tombs. They lie. They pretend to protect. But the truth was there in the dust.